Susapuna monastic Mongana Utanagia. Tawa John, the northern Montpelier, and John. Juta Kd'alamikolba, we call it Lakshmi Plain. Kd'alamikolba. Nindawa ni wala mo din yung option Kd'alamikolba. You don't know what that's for because Kd'alamikolba played a more English. And that plain is from the Russian point to Plattsburgh and the Grand Gulf, she told that lake. And it's sort of a double lake, we call it double lake. That's Kd'alamikolba. And I'll tell you about Abenaki, Masishkobe, Masishkobe, that's what he called it. Masishkobe and Dipsik. And Dipsik, that's a long story here. That's where we'll find Abenaki. Well, to just get to Masis. Abenaki, you'll find that. Masis, we call it. And sure we call it Masishkobe, Masishkobe, Alnôbaiwi. That's what we call it in English, Masishkobe. Then Masis, they find, of course, he was Alnôbaiwi, but you had in the to me friend. Hexes, and some sphere. And they ran about all the military money. Nega Masis, Nina Masis, Salat, Abenaki, Nodamawôakw, what you can have
Just tell them what Simon said, see, and then we'll introduce you later.
Oh, I see.
Well, frankly, I missed some of what Chief Simon said, but he was explaining the meaning of Willisky and Mrs. Squash, and telling you where the Indians were around wlitôgwak and also Vermont territory. That, in short, is what the chief said.
Thank you. Now, we have his two sisters here. You see, we're introducing them in order of their age before beauty. Now we have these two people who are beautiful in appearance as well as in soul, and I'm going to ask Mrs. Royce to say a few words in Abenaki to you. Mrs. Royce is the sister of Simon and Marian. Now, your first name is Elvira, is it? Elvine. Will you please say a few words to the folks?
As I am glad to interview. That is the meaning of it.
Now, these splendid people, for years and years, earned their living in part at least by weaving baskets and by repairing furniture. William, of course, in his youth, as he told you, partly in Abenaki, ranged as far north as James Bay hunting and logging. He worked in Berlin, New Hampshire, booming logs. He's walked 45 miles to a ceremonial on snowshoes and back. His folks used to, as Sagamore's father did, leave in October and say, well, I'll see you next Easter time, and go off trapping and all. And if we had time, we could have him tell you some more of the stories, but it's a turn now of Miss Marian. Now, Miss Marian Obomsawin is an expert at weaving baskets, and many is the happy hour I've spent in her home. When I wasn't admiring her baskets, I was listening to the stories that William told us. Now, somehow the newspapers, probably it wasn't their fault, got the idea that William and Marian were the only ones left. Mrs. Royce, of course, is their sister and speaks French and English, and is it two Abenaki dialects you speak, the Odanak and the Pia? And of course she weaves baskets too. May I ask Miss Marian, please, to say a few words?
I'm glad to meet all the people, and everybody's been so nice to us, and I thank you very much for meeting you all today.
Well, we certainly are more than happy to acknowledge your statement, Miss Elvie, and say that maybe the Sagamore ought to say more later, because I understand, were you once his babysitter? Or are you Manuel's babysitter?
Just occasionally.
Well, now I'll go into my dancing song, which will take maybe 3 minutes, maybe 4, maybe 5. Also says that college professors, talk too much. Well, what about the retired college professors?
Why bring that up?
This map, the main part of it is the green portion, and then next in importance as far as Vermont is concerned is the red portion. The green portion was occupied, and this map is roughly of the date 1600, or it might be 1550. This map shows the location of the tribes which we'll call Algonquian. Now, don't worry about what that means. It just means that there's a great big family of tribes that spoke languages which are very similar. For instance, in my youth, I learned a little Pequot, Mohegan, Puerpi, Montauk. I'm maybe 30 seconds Mohegan, and maybe a dash of Cherokee, I don't know. But anyhow, I learned a little bit of it. And when I came up to this country, so to speak, about 30 years ago, you see, I'm not a Vermonter yet, I found to my great pleasure that there's a lot of material about the people around my hometown there, at the east end of Long Island, up there in the archives of Dartmouth. And I found out that some of the people from eastern Long Island were instrumental in getting Dartmouth pretty well started. But that's another story. The thing that pleased me most was that whenever I met anybody who knew anything about the Indian tongues, they knew about the same words as I did, only more of them. For instance, Miss Elvie and I were talking about corn, and their word is scamon, and ours was socktam, so to speak. Now, these people up in here, where you see the red, were the Iroquois, or the Long House. They had a very similar set of languages. Oh, Mohawk, those are the Mohawks that are nearest us. And then the Oneida, and the Onondaga, and the Cayuga, and the Seneca, and then the Conestoga, and the Erie, and down in here later the Tuscaroras joined them. And then the Cherokees, they got split. Some of them were on a reservation down near the Great Smokies, others of them were shipped out west, you might say. But as far as Vermont is concerned, you notice that Vermont was almost entirely inhabited, except at the north part of the lake, you might say, inhabited during the time we call historical times by Algonquians. Now the Iroquois, however, had been coming over into here time and time again, as we can tell by the remains. When you dig up campsites around here, almost invariably you find some sort of an Iroquoian jug. Now either those things were captured by the Algonquians, the Abenakis, when they went over into New York State, or the Iroquois brought them over here on the raiding party. The fact that they went back and forth is vouched for by the fact that up here at Swanton, the old name for Swanton, one of the old names for Swanton was Taquahanga, which is an Iroquois word meaning bitter, so a waterfowl. But the word Adirondacks is a word which is also Iroquoian. That's what they call the Abenakis. The Iroquoians call the Abenakis Adirondacks because Adirondacks means bark eaters, or those that can live off the forest. Now, over here, too, we find that there is Wawabadanik. Now, Wawabadanik is is the name for Whiteface Mountain. And that is an Abenaki name.
Yeah.
And the name for the White Mountains over here is Abenaki. So you see, they went back and forth, back and forth. There's a big raid from here. The Mohawks went across and burned out the Abenakis in Maine. Oh, when was that, Steve? 1720 thereabouts? Or maybe a little bit earlier.
Earlier than that, I would say.
But anyhow, that is in historical times. We have records of that, and I have a photostat of it from the records down in Albany. Well, within Vermont, notice then, although we have remains of Iroquoian raids, practically all of Vermont was inhabited by some of the tribes of that great big language alliance, which we call the Wabanaki. Wabanaki means dawn people, or dwellers in the east, according to whether you're a poet like Arthur or a would-be archaeologist like me. Notice I said would-be. Over here we have an Abenaki group which is called the Nisiska. If I mistake the pronunciation, why, Steve, you can do the laughing for the bunch. Over here we have the Kd'alamikolba. They were Abenaki, and they used to have a direct connection, regular messenger service between here and these orange portions. Down here were the Zokagis, or plain people, as they call themselves. I notice that's a different word from Sokaki speak. And this one down here were the Obomsawin, our friends here. Now we get that right out of Morrow and others. The Obomsawin apparently went up and down the Lake Champlain shore and also along the Otter Creek. But Colonel Lydius, when he was laying claim to Vermont, or parts of Vermont along the Otter Creek, he says he bought it from the Mohawks. And there is a deed from the Mohawks to Lydius in the archives down at Albany. So there must have been traffic back and forth. Now down here, these are Mohicans. Now the Mohicans are river people, but they're still Algonquians. And here we find that up at the mouth of the Winooski River, there are definitely Mohican remains. Mohican remains down here around Grenville and Lake St. Catherine. I wish somebody would locate the old mission down there. There's a legend that there was a mission around Lake St. Catherine. I haven't been able to find it in either secular or religious history. Over here were the Kawasaks, around Bradford, Newberry, and so forth. They were very definitely Abenakis, and they were part of the messenger service that went up the Assunpink and to St. Francis, and before that, over to Pauline, and before that, over into the Abenaki country in Maine. Down here, these were Penacooks. Now, Penacooks means foothills people. They were Abenakis. They dwelled in around here, and they did not seem to have the messenger service that the rest did. Their messenger service seemed to get down here to the so-called Squawkees. Now, the history of the Squawkees is much too long to recite here. All I want to say is that the Squawkees were Algonquians. These are the Pocumtucks. The Deerfield River runs down through here and then through Franklin County in Massachusetts. Pocumtuck means narrow, crooked, swift river, and so forth. Now, the last in my, there are two more things in my set piece, so to speak. Not only was Vermont, during recent historical times, occupied almost all except up there in Swanton and Grand Isle by Algonquians, Abenakis, but the people that settled up here came from states that were occupied by Algonquians. Most of them came up from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and New Jersey, and also from that part of New York, which was, the Nine Partners, the Amenia part of New York. Notice that all of those parts from which the early settlers came were Algonquian. So a lot of them brought their own Indian names with them. For instance, there's a hill down in Dorset which is called Netop. And the word Netop is just... the word Netop is just a modification of this Algonquian Abenaki word Nidoba. So you can see that we have pretty well traced up as many names as we can to make out a case for this statement that during recent historical times, the people who were in control of the place names in Vermont, insofar as Indian place names are concerned, were the Algonquian stock rather than the Iroquois stock. Now for Steve. Steve is a graduate of Nicollet College. He knows Greek, he knows Latin, and he knows good-looking women. If you don't believe it, look at Margaret. Steve's father wrote at least one grammar. Steve's father collected I don't know how many documents, and when he thought that, and his grandfather too, when he thought that they wouldn't be given proper treatment, he had them, you correct me on this, had them brought down to the Museum of the American Indian in New York. In other words, he worked for more than a generation to preserve the antiquities of the Algonquian, particularly the Abenaki. Now, it's too bad that in 1909, most of you folks remember that, when the then governor of Vermont was helping to celebrate that 1609 business, you know, Champlain and all, instead of sending up the Odanak to get Chief Joseph, this fellow's father, who was still alive, he went over there to Kd'alamikolba and he got a whole bunch of Mohawks. And they didn't have any more business here, by golly, than the folks from the Republic of Panama, for that matter. So with that, I'll just say, Steve has a big treat for us, and if I get up to act as one of his stooges, you'll know that that part at least is prearranged and I'm not interrupting. When he finishes, if you have questions, or if you have questions while he's speaking, I know he won't mind interruption, and then after he speaks, the question period, and we'll get a chance to have more stories, if you want, from Simon and so forth. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Kichi Sagamo Etian Lolo Esano Sagamo Abenakis.
In other words, how do you do, my friends? That seems to be the nearest approach to the English expression, how do you do? Of course, Pakunomzian actually means you look new to me. But of course, for that matter, I probably look new to you also. And maybe I'm a little, perhaps a little bit disappointing because I didn't wear my headdress and my deerskin leggings and so forth. But if you had read in the papers, or if you'd heard that this so-called hereditary chief would come dressed in a gray suit and have red hair and glasses, you might not have come to this meeting. You would have said, well, we can see these Indians right on Main Street here in Montpelier. We don't have to go to the historical meeting. Now, the topic of this talk is the Abenaki Indians in Vermont. Now, it would seem that the first step would be to define our terms and see how the Abenaki relate to other groups ethnically, and then to consider our group as inhabitants of Vermont and give some information regarding their language, as well as their, perhaps if we have time, religion and medicine. If we don't, I'll just skip that part. Now, the Abenaki were a subdivision of the Algonquian nation. As it has been pointed out to you, the language is the basis for classification of tribes. Of course, the Abenaki were only one of many New England tribes. They were subdivided into smaller groups, like as Dr. Huden has said, the wlitôgwak, the Penawopskat, the Kowalsiks, the Missisquoi, and others. But the difficulty that a lot of people have that the specialists at least have in making strict tribal distinctions is due to the fact that these names are geographical rather than racial. When you say, well, they're Missisquoi Indians, they're still Abenaki, but they live near the Missisquoi River. when you say that they're Penobscots, they're Abenaki also, but they live on the Penobscot River. A few years ago, an anthropologist from the University of Pennsylvania said to my father, his name was Dr. Speck, some of you may know him, or may have heard of him. He said to my father, well, Chief Laurent, I have studied your language and your culture, and my conclusion is that you belong to the Kd'alamikolba group of Indians. Well, that was all right. Some years later, he came back and said, no, I'll take that back. I don't think you belong to the Kd'alamikolba. Further research leads me to believe that you belong rather to the Panawamscot group. My father just smiled and said, well, that's all right, Dr. Speck. I just hope that I'll live long enough so that before I die I'll find out just what kind of Indian I am. Now, as I have said, the Abenaki belong to the Algic family, or the Algonquians. They belong to the northeastern division. They went from the Maritimes into Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And from the readings my own personal reading, I would say that the historians agree that it is with this group that the Indian history of Vermont is chiefly concerned. Of course, in making this statement, I hope that there will be no Iroquois present to challenge it. Well, we know, of course, that at the time of Champlain, the Iroquois occupied the upper Hudson and the shores of Lake Champlain. But the founder of New France, with his trusty arquebus, weakened considerably the hold of the Iroquois on this part of the country. And with this weakening, the Abenaki again came into possession of the land. The fact that most of the Indian names in Vermont can be traced to the Abenaki dialect and few to the Iroquois is of considerable significance. A map published by Father Dupreux in 1660 gives Lake Champlain as the western boundary of Abenaki territory. Nevertheless, there is considerable darkness surrounding the Indian occupation of Vermont in the early part of the 17th century. Probably the Jesuits deemed it wiser to establish their missions as far away as possible from the Iroquois territory. And so we have full accounts of what happened in the mission along the Kennebec and the Penobscot rivers, but precious little about any attempt to reach the Indians west of the Connecticut. Another supposition is that they may have thought it not worth their while to investigate villages which may have been only summer colonies in Vermont. Some writers, like Parkman, believe that the Indians in Vermont were merely nomads. Others say no, the Indians had more or less permanent villages, which they left on occasion for hunting, fishing, or corn planting. Still another possible explanation of the scarcity of Indian traces in Vermont is the epidemics that decimated them after the coming of the white man. In short, the difficulty with finding out about the Indians is that they were very careful not to leave any state papers behind as they moved from one stream to another. Even the burial ground evidence is scarce because of the Indian practice of disinterring their dead and taking their ancestors' skeletal remains along with them when they moved on. This was commonly practiced when the encroachment of the white man's cornfields threatened desecration of their ancestors' relics. In other words, the Indians didn't want the bones of their ancestors to be profaned by the white man's plow. Really, therefore, most of what the historian has to go by must be found in the field of linguistics. And it is for this reason that the study of place names is recognized as a significant field for research. Our friend Dr. Huden is now engaged on a serious study along those lines, and he is doing splendid work. A language study, by the way, in one instance, saves the reputation of the Abenakis in Vermont. As you know, the St. Francis Indians, to whom I belong, and who were the Abenakis established along the St. Francis River in Canada, go down in history as fiends. their history has always been painted, they have been painted in red for their raids upon the British colonies. However, in one case, the evidence of one chance word clears them of guilt. In reading about the Royalton raid, we hear that the Indians came down from Canada. Now, some of you might say, well, sure, the St. Francis Indians. They came down from Canada, so they must come from St. Francis. And further along, you come across an Indian word, and you might say, well, that must be an Abenaki word. There's nothing in there to indicate where they came from. But a knowledge of language would show that those were the Iroquois, because the word they use is the word Wasteneron. One of the raiders, they were plundering a house, and he noticed a pair of silver buckles on shoes. And he pointed at it and says, Wasteneron, meaning silver. In plundering, of course, he saw some silver. Well, that's not an Abenaki word. I can prove it to you by showing you an Iroquois dictionary. That's an Iroquois word, it means silver, so therefore they were the Iroquois. Now, because of its importance as a tool of historical research, it might be appropriate to say a few words about the Abenaki language and its characteristics. I shall later give you a sample of its sound as a living tongue. You already have heard one. I'll give you some more. When you heard my good friends William, when you heard him speak in Abenaki, the episodes are historical, and I shall translate them for you into English. That is after I finish with this part. Now, in common with all the North American languages, the Abenaki dialect belongs to that philological group to which has been applied the term holophrastic, a Greek compound which means that a phrase or an entire sentence is compressed in a single word. The Indian mind revels in synthetic methods and aims to compress into one word both object and action, as well as all that relates to the object or modifies the action. A good example is the word awanuts for white man. That consists of the word awani, from. I'll correct that. Awani means u, and udzi means from. This is the way it came about that the white man is called awanuts, because you might not understand why who and from might mean white man. When the Abenaki first came into contact with a white man, they all looked at each other and they said, Awaniutse, meaning who is that man, where does he come from? But they didn't say the whole sentence. They said just who, Awani, would say from. Who from? That's all they needed. That's an illustration of the synthesis that they like to use in talking. I'll give you another word. This one was from the Iroquois tongue, the word skinakwati, meaning the left side. But actually it means more than that. It means the side from which the blood flows. And that to me is remarkable, because it would seem to indicate that the Indians knew of the circulation of the blood even before the famous physiologist Harvey came out with his theory that the blood circulated. The Indians knew before that the blood circulated because they called the left side the side from which the blood flows, skinakwati. And that word is broken down as follows. Nuk would mean flowing blood, ati, the side from, and the initial ska indicates return to the point of origin. Here's another Abenaki word to illustrate what I've just said, that they like to compress into one word a lot of ideas. The word nanibosat. Nanibosat means the moon, but it does mean also the one that travels by night.